So, um, right now, if you look online, a flight to Japan is shockingly, almost suspiciously cheap,
Yeah, it really is.
right? But meanwhile, down in Bolivia,
Huh.
there's this severe currency crisis that literally just triggered street battles and, attempted military coup.
Which is wild.
It is wild. And the crazy thing is, these two completely distinct events, your bucket list holiday becoming incredibly affordable and a geopolitical meltdown on the other side of the planet, they're actually being driven by the exact same invisible engine. So welcome to today's deep dive.
Thanks. Yeah, it's an engine that operates 24 hours a day, shifting trillions of dollars. And most people never really think about its mechanics until they're either trying to pay for a hotel in Tokyo or desperately trying to import basic food and fuel.
Exactly. So today, our mission is to decode those invisible forces. We're taking a magnifying glass to the massive, complex world of global exchange rates.
And we have a great stack of sources for this.
We really do. We've got a 2026 ABC News article analyzing this massive tourism boom in Japan, which is fueled entirely by currency highs. Alongside that, a Guardian analysis breaking down the chaotic tailspins of exchange rates. We've also brought in a set of textbook slides that map out the literal mechanical plumbing of the foreign exchange or forex market.
Right, the real nuts and bolts.
Yeah. And grounding all of this is a really sobering policy paper from the Peterson Institute for International Economics, the PIIE. It details how currency manipulation is like outright crashing developing economies today.
Because moving from holiday planning all the way to systemic geopolitical crises, it requires understanding that the price of money is not a static number. It's a highly aggressive, constantly moving target.
Okay, let's unpack this. The forex market is the biggest market in the world. Centers in London, New York, Zurich, Frankfurt, Tokyo. And the best way to visualize it is to think about the ocean's tides.
I like that analogy.
Right. Because most of the time, the tide is completely invisible to you. You just go about your day. But depending on where you happen to stand on the shoreline, that tide can suddenly a massive bounty right to your feet, or it can completely drag you under.
And in most of the developed world, those tides are governed by what our textbook slides call a freely floating exchange rate system.
Right.
In a freely floating system, the government doesn't intervene to set prices. The value of a dollar or a euro or a yen is determined the exact same way the price of an apple at a farmer's market is determined.
Just pure supply and demand.
Exactly. Pure market forces.
Which brings a massive good wave to your shores right now if you're holding Australian dollars and looking at Japan. Let's use the Aussie dollar, the AUD, as our real-time case study to understand this floating roller coaster.
It's a perfect example.
Because as of early 2026, the ABC News source highlights that the AUD reached a 40-year high against the Japanese yen. It was buying 110.79 yen. We haven't seen a high like that since 1986.
Yeah, that's huge. And under that freely floating system, when a currency's value rises relative to another purely through market demand, that's called an appreciation.
Right. But you used the word roller coaster earlier.
I did. And the word roller coaster is critical here. A freely floating system is notoriously volatile because it absorbs every single global panic and boom in real time.
Which is terrifying.
It is. The Guardian analysis notes that just back in 2023, this exact same currency, the Australian dollar, was in a massive tailspin against the US dollar. It dropped below 63.63 US cents.
Wow.
Yeah, excluding a brief chaotic dip during the early COVID panic, that was its weakest point since the 2009 global financial crisis.
Okay, wait, I need to pause and challenge the logic here a bit.
Go for it.
If a freely floating currency is supposed to reflect the strength of a country's own domestic economy, why did things happening entirely outside of Australia cause that massive crash? Because the sources blame China's COVID lockdowns and the U.S. Federal Reserve's interest rates for tanking the Aussie dollar in 2023. Why on earth would an American interest rate dictate the value of Australian money?
What's fascinating here is we have to step into the shoes of a global investor to understand the sheer scale of capital flows. So imagine you manage $1 billion global pension fund.
Okay, $1 billion, no pressure.
Right, no pressure at all. Your only job, your only mandate is to get the best possible return on that cash. So back in 2023, the U.S. Federal Reserve raised their key interest rate to a range of 5.25 to 5.5%.
Meanwhile, the Reserve Bank of Australia held their rate steady at, what, 4.1%?
Exactly.
So as the manager of that billion-dollar fund, I'm looking at a guaranteed 5.5% return sitting in American banks versus just 4% in Australia. I mean, I'm not leaving my money in Sydney.
You dump it immediately. You sell your Australian dollars. Now, multiply your action by thousands of other global investors doing the exact same thing, and suddenly you create a massive, overwhelming supply of AUD in the global forex market.
And when the supply of anything skyrockets without a matching demand, the price just collapses.
Yep, you take all that cash, you buy US dollars, which instantly increases the demand and price for the USD, and you park it in America to collect that higher interest. That mechanical pursuit of interest rate margins is just a colossal driver of exchange rates.
Okay, so that explains the U.S. side, but what about the China connection? How does a lockdown in Shanghai crash the money in Melbourne?
It comes down to trade exposure as a proxy. The textbook slides outline that foreign demand for a country's exports is a primary factor influencing currency demand. Australia's exports to China are roughly as large as its next four trading partners combined. Yeah, so in the global forex market, investors actually treat the Australian dollar as a liquid proxy for the Chinese economy. If China's economy slows down, their factories buy fewer Australian commodities like iron ore and coal.
So less demand for Australian coal means Chinese buyers need fewer Australian dollars to pay for it. The demand curve drops, and the currency depreciates.
Exactly. And furthermore, speculators see that trend and they start selling off Australian dollars in anticipation of a prolonged slowdown, which just accelerates the depreciation even faster.
It's wild. We're talking about these massive abstract shifts in supply and demand, but the real-world consequences create extreme winners and losers on the ground. Like the Guardian article quotes a National Australia Bank analyst who literally calls exporters happy bunnies when their domestic currency depreciates.
Happy bunnies. It's a funny term, but think about the mechanics for an Australian mining company or a wheat farmer. You sell your goods on the global market, and global commodities are universally priced and paid for in US dollars. If the Australian dollar is weak, meaning it takes far fewer US dollars to buy one AUD, then when you translate those US dollar profits back into your local Australian bank account, the math works heavily in your favor.
Because you get a massive windfall without mining a single extra lump of coal or growing an extra grain of wheat. Your profits jump purely because the exchange rate multiplied your payout.
Exactly. And tourists from strong currency nations, they experience that same windfall. Like we said, Japan is currently being labeled the cheapest place in the developed world. But the reverse is incredibly brutal. Importers suffer what that same Amadi analyst calls a world of pain.
A world of pain. Yeah, if I'm running a business importing luxury Italian ceramic tiles and my local dollar has tanked against the euro, my purchasing power just vanishes. Buying those same tiles suddenly costs me a fortune.
Right. You either absorb a devastating loss or you pass a massive price hike onto your customers.
Which just fuels domestic inflation.
Exactly. And the pain goes far beyond luxury tiles. It affects vital imported electronics, heavy machinery, and critically, fuel and food. Look closely at Japan's situation in 2025 and 2026. It reveals exactly how currencies fundamentally reshape societies. Japan didn't simply stumble into a weak yen by accident.
No, the Bank of Japan actively maintained policies that kept the yen weak.
Yes.
The Guardian analysis describes this as a doom loop. Japan deliberately keeps the yen weak against the US dollar to protect those happy bunny export industries. It makes Japanese cars and electronics artificially cheaper for the rest of the world to buy. But that strategy essentially forces China and South Korea to let their own currencies weaken, just to prevent Japan from stealing all their export competitiveness.
It triggers a regional race to the bottom.
Yeah. Treating your entire country like a discount warehouse has profound unintended consequences.
It really does.
The ABC News source lays out the resulting over-tourism crisis in Japan, and it is staggering. Because the yen was so weak, Japan became the ultimate irresistible destination. In 2025, an unprecedented 42.7 million tourists flooded the country. A record 1.06 million Aussies visited that year alone.
It was so extreme that Japanese authorities had to issue formal warnings about over-tourism.
Yeah, it fundamentally degraded the infrastructure
Mhm.
and the day-to-day lives of the citizens living there. It got to the point where the famous Cherry Blossom Festival in Fuji Yoshida was outright canceled.
Canceled completely.
Yeah, the authorities shut down a historic, beloved cultural event because, and I quote from the source, the quiet lives of local residents are threatened. To me, a rapidly depreciating currency is like a retail store throwing a massive, unannounced 50% off everything sale.
That's a great way to look at it.
You get a huge initial boost in shoppers, your tourists, and your export buyers, but it works too well. The aisles get jammed, the shelves are stripped bare, and eventually the store gets so completely trashed that you literally have to cancel your main event and lock the doors.
And locking the doors doesn't fix the fundamental imbalance. The locals still have to deal with the aftermath. Connecting this to the bigger picture, you can clearly see why the absolute chaos of floating rates, wild interest rate swings, importer bankruptcies, canceled cultural festivals, it makes governments incredibly nervous.
Oh, absolutely.
It's a completely natural reflex for a country to look at that roller coaster and say, we want off, we demand stability. Which brings us to the second major system detailed in our textbook slides, the fixed exchange rate.
Right. So if floating rates are a roller coaster, a fixed rate is a government trying to bolt the roller coaster car directly to the track. They simply freeze the price of their money.
Exactly.
The slides show countries pegging their currency to a massive, stable anchor, usually the US dollar or the euro. Like most Caribbean islands peg to the US dollar because their entire economy relies on American tourists paying in dollars. Fixing the rate guarantees a stable national income.
Makes sense.
And Middle Eastern countries, Oman, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, they peg to the US dollar for absolute stability in global oil trading. Many African nations fix their currency to the euro.
And the terminology shifts here to reflect that control. In a floating system, we see appreciation and depreciation driven by the market. In a fixed system, the government mandates the value. If the government decides to raise the fixed value, it is a revaluation. If they decree it must be lowered, it's a devaluation.
But wait, a government can't just declare a one-to-one ratio and go to lunch?
No.
If the global market decides my country's currency is junk, but my government prints a piece of paper insisting it's still worth exactly $1, who is the sucker actually buying it at that price? Like, how does a country physically force its currency to defy gravity and stay fixed?
The sucker is the government itself.
What do you mean?
To maintain a peg that defies the global market, a country's central bank has to act as the buyer of last resort. The textbook slides break down the brutal mechanics of this intervention. Let's say a country is importing way too much, creating a massive excess supply of their domestic currency in the global forex market. The natural market pressure would force the price down.
So to stop the price from dropping, the central bank has to manually soak up all that excess supply.
They step into the market and buy millions, sometimes billions, of their own currency, and they pay for this using their official foreign currency reserves, their sovereign stockpile of US dollars or euros. By artificially fabricating demand, they force the demand curve to the right, pushing the price back up to match the fixed peg.
So they are literally draining their national savings account, spending hard foreign cash just to prop up the illusion of a price.
Exactly. And once those foreign reserves start running dangerously low, governments have to resort to far more agonizing tactics to maintain the illusion. They might hike domestic interest rates to punishing levels to attract foreign investment, which chokes off lending and slows down their own economy.
Ouch.
Yeah. Or they borrow heavily from international lenders. Or they impose strict exchange controls, making it physically illegal for their own citizens or businesses to convert local money into foreign currency or pay for imports.
Okay, hiking interest rates to attract foreign cash sounds painful, but survivable.
Well, it is survivable until you run out of things to offer. And that is when a stabilizing policy turns into a slow-motion economic collapse. This is where we turn to the policy paper from the Peterson Institute for International Economics. They detail how this exact fixation on fixed exchange rates is currently devastating several developing nations.
Right, because the PIIE paper explains that governments stubbornly hold their exchange rate artificially high because it keeps vital imports like food and medicine cheap for their citizens, and it keeps the cost of repaying foreign debt artificially low.
It creates a temporary political calm. But if domestic inflation rises or export demand drops, that fixed rate becomes completely detached from economic reality. The currency becomes severely overvalued.
And an overvalued currency prices your domestic exports completely out of the world market. Nobody wants to buy your goods because your money makes them artificially too expensive.
Yes. So the country stops earning new foreign reserves from exports, but they are still constantly bleeding their existing reserves to prop up the peg and subsidize cheap imports. It's a fatal mathematical trap.
The PIIE paper provides a brutal inventory of nations caught in this trap. Take Bolivia. For nearly 15 years, Bolivia maintained a rigid fixed rate of 6.90 bolivianos per dollar. They sustained this entirely through a massive boom in natural gas exports.
Right. Selling that gas abroad brought a river of U.S. dollars directly into the central bank's vaults, giving them the ammunition to continuously defend the peg.
But commodities aren't infinite. When the gas boom declined, the river of dollars dried up. They had spent the revenues instead of building a sovereign wealth fund. Now they are entirely out of dollars to defend the 6.90 peg. The inability to import basic goods has led to deep conflict between their current and past president, which is what resulted in actual street battles and an attempted military coup.
Exactly. Exchange rates dictate profound social stability. The paper also points to the catastrophic crisis in Lebanon. Since 2019, Lebanon's exchange rate crashed, the government defaulted, and the banking sector froze.
Yeah, PIIE authors describe the central bank strategy leading up to this as essentially running a Ponzi scheme to maintain the currency peg.
Yes, a literal Ponzi scheme.
Wait, a Ponzi scheme requires paying old investors with new investors' money. How does a central bank run a Ponzi scheme with a currency peg?
Okay, so the central bank desperately needed U.S. dollars to defend the peg. So they offered local commercial banks astronomically high, completely unsustainable interest rates to deposit U.S. dollars with them. The local banks then turned around and offered average citizens massive interest rates to deposit their personal foreign currency savings.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. The central bank used that incoming tide of citizens' dollars to artificially prop up the peg and fund the government.
But they were producing absolutely no underlying economic value to pay those massive interest rates. They just created a colossal debt crater.
Exactly. And when the new dollar deposits slowed down, the entire system instantly unraveled, wiping out the life savings of an entire nation and collapsing the political system.
And just to be clear, we are just impartially reporting the chain of events as stated in the sources, but it is shocking to see this pattern repeat globally. Nigeria is burning through their foreign exchange reserves at a 4-year high just to artificially support their currency, the naira, leading to widespread unrest over the crippling cost of living.
And Egypt faced chronic, paralyzing shortages of foreign exchange and was eventually forced into massive, painful devaluations in 2023 and 2024.
Sri Lanka experienced the exact same cycle. Their foreign reserves completely evaporated trying to defend their currency. The resulting default and economic collapse culminated in the election of an anti-establishment neo-Marxist president just this past weekend. Again, just stating the facts from the sources. But all of these nations share the identical underlying tragedy.
They resisted market realities for far too long. They wasted invaluable sovereign wealth propping up an artificial number instead of letting the currency adjust organically.
So what does this all mean? To synthesize all of this, maintaining a fixed exchange rate during an economic downturn is like building a concrete dam to hold back a massive flood. Instead of opening the floodgates a little bit at a time to let the pressure naturally release, which is exactly what a floating rate does, the government refuses to let any water through. They just keep building the dam higher and higher.
And the fundamental flaw in building that dam higher is that eventually you run completely out of concrete.
And the concrete is their foreign currency reserves.
Yeah.
Once the vault is empty, the water breaches the top, and the entire dam spectacularly collapses, taking the whole valley down with it.
This raises an important question. The experts at the Peterson Institute strongly advocate for dismantling the dam. They argue that flexible, floating exchange rates must act as vital economic shock absorbers.
Right.
A depreciating currency makes imports more expensive, which undeniably hurts consumers in the short term. But it also automatically makes your exports vastly more competitive on the global market. That export boost naturally rebalances your economy, brings in new foreign currency, and creates jobs.
But the immediate political reality is that a floating currency might mean poor citizens suddenly can't afford imported flour or cooking oil. That is why governments build the dam in the first place.
Exactly. And the PII authors offer a specific policy choice to handle that. Instead of artificially mispricing the entire national exchange rate just to keep food and fuel cheap, which wastes billions in foreign reserves and destroys domestic export industries, governments should let the currency float. Then they should use the billions they save from not defending the peg to provide direct, well-targeted financial subsidies straight to the vulnerable populations.
Basically, you don't break the thermometer just because you don't like the temperature in the room. You read the thermometer, and then you buy a coat for the person who is shivering.
I love that. The exchange rate is the ultimate thermometer of the global economy. Attempting to freeze it only masks the underlying illness.
Which brings our deep dive full circle. Whether you're sitting on your couch right now, agonizing over whether to book that ridiculously cheap flight to Kyoto, and a quick warning, The analysts in our ABC source note, there's no sign of a downtrend in the Aussie dollar against the yen, but currencies remain inherently volatile, or whether you are watching the evening news covering violent protests in Bolivia, you now understand the invisible mechanics driving it all. It is a relentless tug of war between harsh market realities and the human desire for total economic control.
It's the perpetual tension between surviving the volatile floating roller coaster and avoiding the tragic, inevitable trap of the peg.
Before we close the book on this deep dive, I want to leave you with one final, highly provocative thought to chew on. As we examined those textbook slides earlier, there was one specific system we skipped over. It sits right in the gray area between the freely floating system and the fixed system.
Yes.
It's formally called the managed float, or as traders far more accurately call it, a dirty float.
The dirty float reveals how governments actually behave when no one is looking.
Exactly. The slides define it perfectly. In a managed float, exchange rates are officially free to float to their market levels over long periods. The government claims they let the market decide. However, central banks secretly intervene to manipulate prices over the short term.
Right.
Their objective is to quietly prevent large fluctuations or gain a competitive edge. They step into the shadows of the forex market, buying and selling massive blocks of currency to shift demand and supply, all without ever officially announcing a peg.
It is systemic intervention hiding in plain sight.
Consider the implications of that. If a managed float means central banks are secretly intervening to manufacture specific outcomes, you really have to question the reality of the major free-floating economies. We discussed Japan actively manipulating the yen through policy to win the export game, triggering a defensive doom loop with China and South Korea.
Yeah.
If everyone with a central bank and a vault full of foreign reserves is manipulating the market just a little bit behind the scenes to gain an export advantage or suppress inflation, is there actually such a thing as a totally free market for money? Or are we all just strapped into a roller coaster where the operator is secretly riding the brakes and slamming the accelerator, all while pretending to have their hands in the air? Something to think about the next time you see a flight to Japan that looks almost too good to be true.